The vast oceans of the Asia-Pacific have long been a bit of a defence industrial thunderdome for some of the world's foremost military shipbuilders. For decades, the United States has been the region's established incumbent, with world-famous designs like the Arleigh Burke. It's been increasingly challenged by the People's Liberation Army Navy, capable of cranking out modern warship designs at rates that no other country can match. And civilian shipbuilding giants Japan and South Korea have proven they're pretty good at cutting warship steel as well. Now though, a new industrial giant appears to have entered the arena: North Korea. Because after decades of basing their naval power, such as it was, on designs that often dated back to the 1960s, Pyongyang has now shown off something very new. Roughly 5,000-tonne destroyers with more individual VLS cells than a small squadron of German frigates, more gun ports than the Flying Dutchman, and apparently a combination of decor choices and smoking policy that wouldn't have looked out of place in a 1980s-era airport lounge. And if Pyongyang is to be believed, they're not planning to slow down. Planning to roll out 2 large surface combatants per year, including a new 10,000-tonne design. Because apparently, when your nation has a nominal GDP closer to Burkina Faso than Beijing, aspiring to roughly match the United States on destroyer tonnage produced per year is a totally sensible and reasonable defence industrial goal. And so today, it's time to talk about North Korea's somewhat strange new naval ambitions and the ships that symbolise them. So we'll first zoom back to North Korea and talk about how the last couple of years have changed their diplomatic and economic context. Then switch over to the focus of today, the Korean People's Army Navy, and the fairly dismal state it was in going into the 2020s. Then we'll look at the North Korean shipbuilding program, and especially these 2 new destroyers, including a look at some of their key features, good, bad, and distinctly North Korean. Finally, we'll look at, from my perspective, the weirdest aspect of this entire exercise, which isn't so much the ships themselves, but the fact that a country in North Korea's position has decided to build them at all. And so, a couple of years after our previous episode on them, welcome back to North Korea. Politically and economically, the last couple of years have been very eventful from Pyongyang's perspective. The economy has had its good years and bad years, inflation has varied between high and higher, but the war in Ukraine has arguably opened the door to one major change. North Korea isn't exactly a country with a huge array of economically valuable exports. But Russia's military misadventure in Ukraine meant that some of the things that North Korea does have, like rusty artillery shells, went through price spikes that wouldn't be out of place on the RAM market. Through their partnership agreement, the general assessment is that North Korea has been able to generate billions of dollars in hard currency, resources, and technical assistance from Moscow in exchange for lavish shipments of things like artillery shells, tactical ballistic missiles, and of course the assistance of tens of thousands of North Korean troops fighting in areas like the Kursk region. It's also arguably delivered windfalls to Pyongyang in other ways. It's sometimes glossed over, for example, that many of the sanctions put in place by North Korea were put there by the United Nations Security Council, which required the assent of Moscow. This alliance then has both killed the prospect of any new sanctions and also undermined the enforcement of existing ones. Sure, for example, on paper, North Korea might not be allowed to export munitions to the international market, but the current system basically relies on Russia policing military shipments to Russia, which is kind of like putting Al Capone in charge of prohibition enforcement. It also appears to have potentially opened North Korea up to a major source of military technical assistance. Either that, or we've seen some remarkable cases of recent parallel design evolution. See, for example, the comparison between this Russian Pantsir M air defense system on the top right, and that obviously entirely indigenous North Korean system installed on one of their destroyers on the bottom right. This potentially matters a lot from a military perspective because while there's a lot that North Korean defence industrial base might be able to do, there are going to be limits. Just as with the Iranians, who in some ways have been able to accomplish remarkable feats given their circumstances, the North Koreans have been able to pull off some pretty impressive stuff as well, given the resources available, but some stuff in the military technology space is just really, really hard. And if you're given an option as a country between painstakingly developing it entirely yourself, or alternatively buying in that know-how from somewhere else in exchange for goods you already have a lot of, like old artillery shells or people, the possibility is open to really jumpstart your military modernisation in new ways. So you have a situation where North Korea has been able to achieve a windfall of foreign assistance and hard currency inflows, much broader access to a whole array of strategically valuable technologies, and so what we've pretty consistently seen is Pyongyang deciding to plough that technological and financial windfall into improving the living standards of a population that suffered so badly, especially during the COVID and immediate post-COVID years. Nah, just kidding. A lot of it went straight into a military build-up. And unlike other recent North Korean military modernisation efforts, this time the Navy appears to have been included. Just to set the context, the North Korean Navy, to use a technical term, is a bit shit. And I need to stress, that's not just some arrogant Western-centric assessment, that's more or less what the North Koreans themselves are saying. The Korean People's Army Navy, or KPAN, has occasionally copped a bit of shade. Kim Jong-un recently described his navy as having gone through, quote, over 70 years of stagnation, end quote, and declared that, quote, in terms of military hardware, the navy was the weakest of all the services of our armed forces, end quote. And given by the North Korean account, his ancestor was apparently born on a sacred mountain under a shining star as a level 100 super genius future revolutionary leader who went around asking people totally normal childhood questions like why do the rivers flow or why should workers and peasants become masters of factories and land. I think we have to assume he probably knows what he's talking about. I will say this, the English language version of the North Korean biography of Kim Jong-il is certainly a unique reading experience. Jokes aside, the numbers in this case definitely seem to back up that evaluation. Back in 2021, when the North Korean ground forces were north of 1 million strong, the Navy came in at about 60,000 personnel. And while 70 years of stagnation might have been an exaggeration in some equipment categories, in others, it was pretty close to the mark. At a high level, the North Korean force of a couple of years ago was not a blue water navy. It was a largely coastal mosquito fleet, kind of in the same vein as something like the Iranian IRGC naval forces. For the most part, it was based around hundreds and hundreds of patrol and coastal combatants. Some missile boats, like the ones you see on the right there, both older and newer, that could potentially, in swarm attacks, have posed a threat to more advanced surface combatants by swarming their defensive systems with anti-ship missiles. But there was also a bunch of hulls that were just kind of there. There were reportedly 12 Taechong heavy patrol boats, for example, you can see one on the right there, that visibly feature a significant gun armament, including an 85mm main gun that might have been taken from a tank at some point, but probably wouldn't be a great match for a lot of the things they'd be likely to encounter on a modern battlefield. Many of the smaller boats that did have missiles only mounted a handful of launchers, 2 to 4, and potentially the most common single subclasses in the North Korean Navy were actually not missile boats, they weren't patrol boats, they were torpedo boats. Military Balance 2021 estimated about 142 torpedo boats, broadly equivalent to the one you see on the top right there, that would presumably have had to get very close to an enemy ship they were trying to engage in order to launch their torpedoes, and even if they managed, would likely be working with Soviet lineage torpedoes and designs dating back to the 1960s. Against civilian vessels, or maybe as part of a large-scale swarm attack against an isolated naval warship, potentially these kind of things may have been slightly dangerous. But one imagines the survivability of any such sortie would have been life insurance required. The submarine force on paper was also fairly numerous, but at the same time, operating a lot of equipment that wouldn't have looked out of place in other countries' museums. The standard submarines, if you like, were 20 copies of the old Soviet Romeo class, a design the Soviets stopped manufacturing in 1961, and which North Korea received its first deliveries on from the People's Republic of China in 1973. On the right there, you can see Kim Jong-un enjoying a joyride on one of the vessels, and you have to presume they probably would have put the top bloke in one of the best ships in the fleet, so I think it's fair to assume that by the standards of the rest of the force, that one's in relatively good shape, all things considered. And to top it all off, the submarines are believed to rely on the old Soviet Sayat-60 torpedo, which first entered service in 1961. Not exactly a direct equivalent of a Mark 48 ADCAP or a UK Spearfish. I bring that up because it's not quite 70 years of stagnation, but when you're pushing 1960 systems into service in 2026, you are starting to get a bit close. There are also smaller and midget submarines. You can see an example of one that was captured by the South Koreans on the right there to give you a sense of scale. But a lot of these would be useful only very close to the shore, or for things like infiltrating special forces teams. Remember, the Iranians were also believed to operate some smaller submarines as well, and they played very little role in the current hostilities, at least as far as we know. As far as larger warships went, things that would be classified as frigates in other navies, the North Koreans had exactly 2. Built in the 1970s, on paper they're capable of roughly 26 knots, mount 2 anti-ship missiles, an array of manually operated gun systems, and a rack of depth charges. They're also arguably, as you can see from some of the photos on the right there, showing their age a bit, with the bottom right image showing how rundown one of the ships already was in 1993. So basically, prior to this wave of investment, the North Korean Navy was run on a shoestring budget meant to primarily be a somewhat dangerous economical coastal force. There were lots of small, cheap ships with dangerous weapons like anti-ship missiles or torpedoes that could potentially be concealed or hide from opposing air and naval power, but also potentially sortie out in large groups to launch swarm attacks and potentially threaten any overconfident adversary. If that sounds a lot like some of the descriptions we've given of the IRGC and Iranian navies in the past, it perhaps shouldn't be surprising, given they were 2 states with relatively limited resources, with the same potential globe-spanning blue water navy as a potential opponent. In recent years, though, that force design appears to have fallen out of favour in Pyongyang. The tides have changed, and the money is now apparently there to try and build a very different KPAN. If you're wondering which service will probably win the prize as the most technically backward now, that's likely to be the Korean People's Army Air Force, which has mostly had to make do with receiving older fourth-generation fighters from Russia, with any potential acquisitions of something newer, like the Sukhoi 35, still very much hypothetical. Even before this latest destroyer commissioning, though, the Navy wasn't just talking about rolling out new equipment, it was showing it off. By Military Balance 2026, for example, the IISS credited the North Koreans with 2 relatively modern corvettes of the Amnok class. In some technical respects, the ships weren't quite there yet. There was no VLS and the main gun was manually operated, but the hull form looked comparatively modern. The sensors were a significant step up from what had come before. There was a Russian-style Sea Whiz aft, and the ship was capable of firing a small number of cruise missiles. The North Koreans were also in the process of working on at least 2 ballistic missile submarines, with the North Koreans here, for example, appearing to add an extra missile-launching sail section to the top of the submarine, potentially capable of carrying a relatively humble number of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Brief historical side note here for those of you who might be interested. One of those North Korean submarines, the Hero Kim Kon-ok, was named after a Korean War-era naval leader whose claim to fame included taking a small flotilla of North Korean torpedo boats up against a United Nations naval flotilla, and despite being horrifically outgunned, managing to sink the US cruiser Baltimore in July 1950. This is particularly impressive given the Baltimore wasn't in Korea in 1950 and is pictured here safely stateside in 1951 before its eventual second very peaceful decommissioning in 1956. Non-North Korean records of the battle point to the UN force that actually was present suffering 0 casualties, while the North Koreans lost 3 torpedo boats. But hey, I can't imagine fact-check attempts go down particularly well in the North Korean military history department, and so the Battle of Chemoncheon was obviously a great North Korean victory, and the submarine's name is the submarine's name. Now, despite North Korea making some relatively grandiose claims about the design, you'll likely be shocked to hear there might have been a couple of issues with the program. It was reported in mid-2025, for example, that almost 2 years after it had been launched, there was no real sign that Submarine 841 had actually entered operational service. It remained docked under a security canopy at the Sinpo South shipyard, with the IISS convinced that the submarine hadn't put to sea for any extended period since it was unveiled in September 2023. So, fully operational, probably not, but operational enough to at least trundle out into the water and launch a missile or 2, probably, based on what we've seen. And you certainly can't fault the DPRK when it comes to ambition, because they've said they're pushing ahead with their first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. The submarine is reportedly meant to be a roughly 8,000-tonner, again with that very distinctive sail missile launching section, potentially capable of carrying and launching 10 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and giving North Korea a naval leg to its nuclear delivery systems. Speaking of SLBMs, it's worth noting that while the North Koreans might not be on par with the major nuclear powers, their first apparent test of an SLBM actually dates all the way back to late 2021. And while we can't be sure they've successfully integrated a warhead with the design, for example, or what its maximum range and reliability are, the safe assumption is that given enough time and investment, they're likely to mature the kind of capabilities that, remember, the Soviet Union and the United States had by the mid-Cold War era. So you had a situation where we could see the North Koreans modernising some of their smaller vessels, trying to develop a submarine nuclear missile fleet to enhance their nuclear deterrence force, but the bit we care about today is that that's not where the ambition ended, because the leadership in Pyongyang also espoused an ambition to build a blue water surface fleet, with actual modern surface combatants capable of projecting power far from North Korea's shores. And in the context of modern naval operations, that's often going to mean the likes of destroyers, frigates or cruisers. And so, not satisfied with sticking a nuclear missile array on the back of a 1960s-era submarine design, the North Koreans set out to build some modern destroyers. These 2 5,000-tonners, hull numbers 51 and 52 that we've been talking about, were going to be the leading edge of the effort. And given they were going to be several times larger and much more advanced than anything floating the country had produced in the past, constructing them was always going to be a bit of a learning experience, like learning how to get them into the water successfully without tipping them onto the side. Back in 2025, Hull 52 made it part of the way into the water during the launching process, tipped over, but was eventually recovered. The lessons learned process that reportedly followed was the kind of thing Silicon Valley can only dream about, with many of those involved being arrested for fates unknown, and the ship was eventually refloated, with North Korean news describing the ship as having, quote, safely entered the water vertically, end quote. I mean, really though, I'm not sure why they arrested those involved. Can you imagine how much harder it would have been to refloat if they waited until it was entirely in the water to tip it over? So really you can argue by getting the process out of the way early, they maximise lesson learned potential and minimise the time required. Occasional construction hiccup aside, the stated North Korean building plan beyond these two ships is nothing if not ambitious. Kim Jong-un has reportedly said the goal should be to build at least 2 large surface combatants of this size or larger per year for the next 5 years. And given the potential consequences of publicly making a liar out of the leader, I imagine there's some pretty strong incentives on the North Korean shipyards to turn those ships out. As we hinted near the start of the episode though, 2 destroyers a year is absolutely no joke. The United States Navy is currently in the business of commissioning roughly 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers per year, and even if you adjust for displacement and consider both these North Korean ships roughly equivalent to an Arleigh Burke, you're still talking about a country with a GDP less than a third of the size of New York City's budget, trying to turn out half as much destroyer tonnage per year as the United States Navy. And that's if it's only 2 ships per year and they stick to the 5,000 tonners, because Kim Jong-un apparently has ambitions to go much, much bigger. North Korean media have said they apparently want a 10,000 tonner, a strategic ship as it's sometimes described, at which point you probably can't argue against them using the Blue Water Destroyer designation. After all, at 10,000 tonnes, you'd be talking about a ship that displaces very slightly more than the latest blocks of Arleigh Burkes. But those North Korean superships don't exist yet, so let's talk about the 2 that do. Well, we're mostly going to be talking about the headline of the hour, the Hyon, hull number 51. Remember, it does have a sister ship as well, so when I'm using images or examples in this section, keep in mind they may come from either of the 2 vessels. Similarly, in terms of the used footage, both hulls have been showed off at various times. Most recently, hull 51 to celebrate its commissioning, and number 52 in a bit of a separate firepower demonstration that followed shortly thereafter. So basically, if I say this ship, I could be referring to either of them. So far though, even though we've seen hull number 52 demonstrate a couple of its systems, only 51 has been officially commissioned. And looking across its visible systems, it's hard to compare this to anything else the North Koreans currently have in service, because it looks to have, at least at first glance, a lot of the features you'd expect of a relatively modern guided missile destroyer. One which the North Koreans demonstrated performing a variety of military manoeuvres, including cruising around at relatively leisurely speeds, and then continuing North Korea's long-standing campaign against the local sea life by rippling off an array of PGMs into the ocean. Obviously, the North Koreans aren't about to give us the full specifications or allow us to interview the designers of the vessel to ask what they had in mind, but even just from the outside looking in, there are a couple of observations we can make about the kind of trade-offs and priorities the designers apparently had. For one, this is a missile boat first, with lots and lots of VLS. That afterray appears to contain 64 cells of various types, with an additional 24 cells forward, bringing the total to 88 on a ship of 5,000 tonne displacement. For comparison, a US Arleigh Burke class mounts 96 Mark 41 cells on a ship about twice that displacement. That said, unlike the Mark 41 spam of the Arleigh Burke, the North Koreans appear to be using multiple different types of VLS in their array. It's very clear even just from this image that the sizes do vary, and we're probably looking at different cell types optimised for different missiles. And so while we probably can't safely make assumptions about the length of all of these cells, the launch missiles appear to come from the cells in the top right of this image. And given the missiles they appear to be cold launching here, we can probably conclude that they at least are going to be cruise missile capable strike length cells. With the others we can speculate, but there's less certainty. Okay, I'm going to cut her off here and talk over the footage. To highlight, I haven't seen any footage of cruise missiles being fired from the forward cells. Those are notably much closer to the waterline, but we can't be entirely sure yet what exactly the North Koreans can fit in them. One small clue is that previously we did see the ships appear to mount some smaller VLS in that forward section, although those appear to have been swapped out for larger ones sometime in 2025, and we'll get back to that in a moment. As you can see in this footage, the North Koreans haven't exactly been shy about rippling off fairly large salvos during these demonstrations, which is not something you'd normally see navies do regularly, because that's a lot of money to just throw into the ocean. Fortunately, North Korea is an incredibly wealthy country with no competing budgetary priorities, and so they can afford to invest in producing a satisfactory number of very expensive contrails. There are additional semi-concealed anti-ship missile box launchers held amidships that we've seen fired off in at least one exercise, and if you zoom in on the vessel's aft section, you'll also find this thing I mentioned earlier. On the top right, you have the unnamed North Korean short-range air defense system mounted on the destroyer in question, and on the bottom right, the Russian Pantsir M. A cynic might suggest that this is the same picture, but remember, Kim Jong-un stressed that this ship was constructed with no outside assistance, so obviously this is something entirely different. If it were a Panzer M, however, we could safely assume that it added 4 short-range air defence missiles and 2 Gatling cannons to the ship's armament, meaning that in total, across the VLS, anti-ship missile launchers and the short-range air defence system, you're probably looking at a total count of more than 100 missiles carried. If your primary metric for a modern warship is how many missiles it manages to pack on a seaworthy hull of a given displacement, then frankly, the North Koreans appear to have done a decently good job. The ship also appears to mount 2 gun-style close-in weapon systems mounted port and starboard, meaning on paper this thing's packing considerably more point defence than a lot of the other designs in this kind of displacement category you'll see worldwide. In this case, they bear a significant but imperfect resemblance not to a Russian system, but to the Chinese Type 730. Even just looking at the exterior of the ship, there are almost certainly areas where it lags behind modern competitors, with the big one being sensors, with the visual clues we have suggesting the ship probably does lag behind the most recent Chinese designs, for example. Other assumptions we can't make based on externals, but are probably safe to make regardless, the North Korean ship probably lags behind when it comes to various internal systems, and we haven't seen either of the North Korean ships really gun it on camera yet, so there are still massive open questions over aspects like the propulsion plant, maximum speed, and sea-keeping qualities. But just in terms of the observable hard factors and the design philosophy they seem to suggest, you could argue that part of what Pyongyang has done here is build a relatively modern-looking guided missile destroyer straight out of the Soviet or Russian school of thought. You build something that floats, and then you arm it to the absolute teeth. Some modern Russian designs have at least somewhat channeled that old philosophy, if you compare the likes of what they've packed into an Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate, for example, compared to a NATO frigate in the 4,000-ton range, whereas the made modern Chinese surface combatants are much closer to their American equivalents. The North Korean design, by contrast, appears to allocate much more of the ship's real estate to the missile systems. That might suggest that, very broadly speaking, it's long on anti-ship and land attack firepower, but likely to be shorter on things like endurance, sensors, and survivability. But look, these are all things we would mention if we were talking about an ordinary warship made by an ordinary nation. But today, we're talking about the good old DPRK. And to be sure, that means there are a couple of odd features included here that I think are worth a mention. Now, while we obviously don't have full schematics of the thing, Pyongyang has helpfully released a number of videos and images of the ship being inspected or put through its paces, with the title of the one you can see on the screen here giving you a rough idea of the tone. Now, as part of the demonstrations, the ship did show off its performance in some highly challenging and realistic military scenarios, like, mag dumping the ocean 100 metres away. Obviously, we've come to take things like firing long-range missiles into the Sea of Japan or yeeting cruise missiles as a given at this point, but now we know if a surface action does devolve into broadside combat at Nelsonian distances, the North Koreans are trained and ready. In the zoomed-in shots, though, this demonstration actually gives us an interesting look at the ship's armament. For one, as you can see, the defensive suite is actually fairly dense for a ship of this displacement. Larger American or Chinese designs, for example, might only mount 1 or 2 Seaways emplacements, usually fore and aft, but the North Koreans appear to have gone with 1 rotary emplacement on either side of the ship, and that's in addition to the other Panzer-style short-range defence systems that we mentioned earlier. Also visible in this image, you have at least 4 heavy machine guns that are being fired without a human visible on the trigger. Autocannon and HMG mounts on ships are nothing new, neither are remote weapon stations for naval use, and I'd argue that in all kinds of asymmetric engagement scenarios, like for example dealing with naval drones, you can probably make a legitimate case that there's not a whole bunch of harm in packing a bunch of extra machine guns for close defence. We've certainly seen the Russians, rush to fit a whole bunch of additional machine guns to a lot of their ships in the Black Sea to deal with Ukrainian naval drones. They might have a secondary role against UAS, and especially in the case of the ones mounted higher on the ship, those might have better sightlines and be able to engage targets from further away. So far, arguably so good, but this is North Korea, and 4 guns is clearly not enough DACA, and so apparently we also have these. If you notice the barrels poking out to participate in the firepower demonstration, those are indeed firing ports of some kind, where a designer has presumably made a conscious decision to leave a closable hole in the side of the ship so they can poke an additional gun out. There are many reasons that ships around the world haven't generally done this since the pre-dreadnought era, and even then, some secondary guns might be in turreted or semi-turreted arrangements. This appears more akin to the gun ports of a ship of a line, or the military equivalent of just sticking a machine gun out a window. One can't imagine these guns have particularly good fields of fire or vision compared to the ones mounted higher on the deck. And before you go thinking, hey Perun, maybe they're on some kind of advanced, stabilised, remote-controlled mount that could potentially make them a bit more useful, perhaps more akin to those other parts of the secondary armament. Oh no, we have images from inside the ship. This appears to be Kim Jong-un walking past one of those guns in the stowed interior position, and it is literally just a heavy machine gun on a manually controlled mount in the hallway of a ship that you can point out of the opening. This is obviously fantastically safe, ergonomic, and very militarily useful. No notes. I especially like the way you have to walk past the barrel of a heavy machine gun in order to access a life vest, or flag the entire area and the stairs in order to rotate the gun into the firing position out the side. Oh, and as for the potential effects on the hearing of anyone letting rip with a HMG essentially inside a metal box, let's just say the North Korean Navy better not skip on the ear pro. But obviously they had no choice because no one has ever come up with a more convenient method of mounting heavy weapons on the deck of a warship with a large field of fire and a lot of visibility. You know, like this. Look, this isn't a massive criticism of the vessel or anything, it's just weird. Yes, we've seen navies show interest in adding more heavy machine guns and more autocannons to surface combatant designs, especially for the counter-drone role. But if you are going to try and add more DACA, cutting holes in the side of the vessel superstructure just seems like an odd way to do it. Then we need to look inside the thing, because with this vessel, North Korea appears to have challenged not just the primacy of the United States Navy, but the long-standing dominance of French pre-dreadnought battleships, for building warships that sometimes look less like warships, and instead floating hotels with unusually heavy armament. As I said, the North Koreans released footage, allegedly of a walkthrough of the vessel by Kim Jong-un, that allows us to see, allegedly, parts of its interior. Some elements we can probably confirm as automatically genuine, like the bridge where we can see outside, but we also got a lot of interior shots, and I just want to show you a couple. Here they are, just try and look closely and retain these in your visual memory for a moment. Here's some shots of Kim Jong-un walking through the vessel. Then we have both the CIC, the Combat Information Center on the top right there, and an image taken on the bridge on the bottom right, where Kim Jong-un, as you can see, demonstrated his highly tactical headset-wearing technique, before even giving us footage like this, where he walks out into the wide corridor and passes a militarily necessary plinth with a potentially unsecured bust. Now, even if we are maximally fair to the North Korean depiction here, we assume that all of these images and video actually were taken on the ship, and it was probably done up for the inspection, so maybe the images on the wall would be taken down and the bust not actually kept in the hallway when the ship went out on patrol. If you look at shot after shot after shot of this video, something that stands out to me is this isn't what warships normally look like. Sure, he might only be covering certain areas of the ship, but let me show you a couple of comparison images to help me explain. These are shots taken inside an American Zumwalt-class ship. If you have more than a little bit of time, you are welcome to count how many instances of exposed piping, exposed wiring, exposed equipment, and ready firefighting equipment you can see in just those two images. To contrast a bit of European design aesthetic here with the inside of a FREM-class frigate, and to prove this is not just a case of NATO standardisation agreements aggressively prohibiting the involvement of interior designers in ship construction, here's an interior shot from a Japanese Megami-class frigate showing you yet more of the same. You absolutely can have, for lack of a better term, more aesthetic, more finished elements of a military vessel, and a lot of the time, those are going to be exactly the kind of spaces you might expect to get that treatment. That's reportedly a mess facility aboard a Chinese Type 55 destroyer, for example, and besides the vaguely public transport style print choice on the seats, I'd argue that's fairly nice. Then you have areas where different navies or different designers might make different choices. Compare, for example, what the UK did with the bridge of the Queen Elizabeth-class carrier on the top right, with what the United States did with perhaps the world's most expensive active warship, the Gerald R. Ford, on the bottom there. There are going to be rooms and spaces on ships where design decisions like this are up for grabs, and you may or may not be dealing with this kind of industrial aesthetic. But outside those specific cases, most warships probably aren't going to make a huge amount of use of smooth ceilings and wood grain. And there are so many reasons that feed into that, from space management, system integration, survivability, and big ones, maintenance and damage control, because if something's broken, you want to find it and fix it. Warships look the way they do, not because people specifically appreciate the industrial chic, but because from a point of view of how you build, how you manage volume, how you integrate systems, and how you maximise survivability, this is the approach that tends to make more sense. Now, obviously it's possible that parts of the vessel that Kim Jong-un and the camera crews were not shown are more industrial and practical in design. But across all the footage and images I could find, we don't appear to have seen them. Instead, you get this kind of stuff. Nary an access panel in sight, and a look I've seen some commentators compare more to a civilian vessel than a guided missile destroyer, which serves as a very loose segue into one of the other theories about how this ship was potentially constructed. Given their available resources, the North Koreans claim to have built these ships relatively quickly, and maintaining a cadence of 2 ships a year going forward would be a serious effort for a lot of global shipbuilders. Thus, it seems at least moderately likely that North Korea might have chosen to lean more on civilian-style ship construction standards and materials rather than conventional military ones. One of the reasons military surface combatants tend to take so long to construct and be so expensive isn't just all of the expensive subsystems and system integration challenges, it's also just that things like survivability standards insisted on by so many modern navies are just kind of expensive to construct into a design. If the DPRK was hypothetically willing to skip some of that, they could potentially leverage dual-use civilian components, the shipbuilding capacity of civilian dockyards, perhaps dual-use components or constructions coming out of other nations' shipyards, and if nothing else, all else being equal, would be able to chop down the time and complexity involved. In some military shipbuilding contexts, that might make perfect sense, and we've seen other countries do so in the past. The French Mistral class, for example, was a bit of a hybrid. It maximised the use of civilian shipbuilding techniques where practical, and the result was ships that were militarily useful, but more affordable than they otherwise would have been. Now, if infinite money and shipbuilding capacity had been available, maybe the French would have taken a different approach. But if you're primarily using something in low to moderate threat environments or for disaster relief and humanitarian missions, then you can absolutely make the case that sometimes the higher standards aren't necessary. I obviously can't prove that's what the North Koreans have done to any extent here, but I certainly think there's circumstantial evidence that they might have chopped a couple of design corners. A final thing to note is that even just between early 2025 and now, we've seen a number of changes made to the ship that would constitute significant refits on just about anything else. What you can see on the right there, for example, are comparisons of photos taken of the vessel in April 2025 with later shots taken in October. The mixed-size 32-cell forward VLS array was compressed down to a all-medium-sized 24-cell arrangement, while this image here gives you a better idea of the old and new configuration aft, with the North Koreans increasing the amount of real estate apparently allocated to the VLS, while retaining some apparent diversity in the sizes used. And the Russian AK-630 style Seawiz was replaced with something that looks awfully like a Chinese Type 730. What that suggests is either the armament package in April was partially a placeholder or a mock-up, or the North Koreans legitimately installed one entire weapon set, only to later rip it out, replacing very roughly half the VLS real estate and a significant chunk of the secondary and defensive armament. And they even appear to have made switches when it came to the sensors and electronic warfare suite. Compare some of the features of that image taken in April 2025 on the top, with the revised version you can see on the bottom. That suggests, again, either the design wasn't finalised, or it was, but they were installing placeholder components because they didn't have access to what they actually wanted. So suffice to say, if this was a ship being built by any other navy and we were evaluating it as any ordinary surface combatant, there would be a couple of things to raise an eyebrow here. But not to get all defence economic centric on you, but for me at least, from more of a procurement-focused perspective, the biggest question about this ship isn't the portholes, it isn't the wood grain, it isn't the damage control features or the apparently ever-changing design. It's much more fundamental. What are these ships actually meant to do, and what's the underlying defence investment logic here? Alternatively, expressed in the words of the internet, why though? Because from my defence economic-centric perspective, the interesting thing here isn't necessarily the ships themselves, it's why a country with North Korea's resources and strategic context would decide to build them. Often, or at least ideally, when countries put down a stack of cash in order to purchase high-end military platforms, they do it with a particular role in mind. The challenge here is that of all the roles the North Koreans have publicly suggested for the ships, or which we might be able to infer from their design, it's not clear why a 5,000-tonne destroyer would be the best investment option. If you look at North Korea's strategic geography, arguably distant blue water concerns are about the least immediate of its challenges. It has land-based supply lines to China, but also a land border with the Republic of Korea, and a bunch of South Korean, American and Japanese air and naval power positioned pretty much on its strategic doorstep. And so one of the most immediate questions is, how does a country in a position like that actually intend to try and get value out of a guided missile destroyer? So let's quickly go through some of the suggested roles. 1, KCNA has suggested these ships could be nuclear delivery platforms. The implication there might be that North Korea could take something like a nuclear-tipped cruise missile, put it on the Choe, and give the KPAN a capability broadly equivalent to what the Americans are going for with their new sea-launched cruise missile. As a nuclear weapons delivery platform, though, I'd suggest that for North Korea, looking to add a naval leg to their growing nuclear triad, surface ships are a bit of an odd choice. We know the country is already investing significantly in ballistic missile submarines, and according to them, they already have 2 that work mostly. They've also ploughed the funds into a submarine-launched ballistic missile and claimed at least one test, so a weapon should be on the way for these subs. And if the goal is nuclear deterrence, it's hard to see how this isn't just a better option. All else being equal, a submerged submarine on patrol is going to be harder to identify, track, and kill than a surface combatant that's going to be visible to every relevant civilian satellite up there, let alone dedicated military constellations. A nuclear-tipped SLBM is going to have significantly more range than a cruise missile, be harder to intercept than a cruise missile, and arrive at very distant targets faster than a cruise missile. If the goal was to deter the United States, for example, a North Korean ballistic missile submarine would only have to make its way perhaps somewhere into the Pacific, while a destroyer would have to cruise most of the way across it, hoping to never be detected or sunk along the way, and then hope the cruise missiles it fires aren't shot down by American fighters or air defense systems. Basically, there is a reason all the major nuclear powers out there have decided to base the sea leg of their deterrent on the ballistic missile submarine, not nuclear-tipped cruise missiles fired by destroyers. That's not to say planners don't see any role out there for nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, they're just a bit niche. And so they'd seem like an interesting thing for North Korea to potentially focus on before it's got more of the basics covered. And if instead the argument was maybe the submarine force is considered too expensive or too high risk, or North Korea isn't confident they can make them work or turn them out in large enough numbers, then the simplest answer isn't to design a new nuclear-tipped cruise missile and put it on a new class of warship, it's to just take the big-ass ground-based missiles you already have and use those. North Korea already has road-mobile ICBMs capable of reaching targets not just at a regional level, but reportedly also out to the continental United States. We're not certain which, if any, have successfully had nuclear warheads designed and integrated with them, but all else being equal, it's going to be much easier to design at least a unitary warhead that can fit on one of those than it is on a conventional cruise missile. If your goal is nuclear deterrence as North Korea, these systems have a raft of advantages. You already have them and a production line for them. They're going to be cheaper. They have the range necessary to reach more targets. They're much more complex for air and missile defense systems to handle. And above all, if you're a paranoid state, worried about a potential first strike, they're also likely to be much, much more survivable. While you could attempt it, I guess, decoy warships don't really work. Decoy TELs, however, much simpler. With road mobile launchers, you can churn out the decoys, camouflage and conceal them, or bury them deep in bunkers. The Iranian experience with their missile cities here is arguably fairly telling. When American air power came into play, their surface fleet was whacked fairly quickly, but by recent reports, a decent number of the buried TELs and missile systems might have survived. Sure, the Americans were able to temporarily collapse the entrances, but eventually, with a bit of excavation equipment, the Iranians might have been able to recover at least some of them. Basically, with ground-based launchers, you have proven defensive technologies like dirt and concrete at your disposal. And so if the goal is to produce a credible, survivable deterrent with as little investment as possible, this is probably a cheaper, more proven pathway than multi-thousand-ton destroyers. And if the argument is instead is that these wouldn't be strategic nuclear weapons, but pre-strategic or tactical ones, sure, if North Korea wants tactical-style nuclear capabilities of that type, they already have ground-based delivery systems for that as well. The KPA already has, for example, very heavy 600mm plus MRLs like the one you see on the bottom right, and also systems like the one you see on the top right, pod-based MRLs capable of firing everything from unguided rockets to larger TBMs, that, in what I'm sure is nothing more than a complete coincidence, looks awfully like what would happen if you told a North Korean engineer to build their own HIMARS at home. As you can see, KMARS is configured for a TBM in that image, and there's no reason to believe a country capable of designing and manufacturing a miniaturized nuclear warhead that could fit on the cruise missile of a warship couldn't do the same for a TBM. Concealment would presumably be even easier, warning times lower, and platform costs basically incomparable. But okay, maybe instead the interest here is in bulking out North Korea's air defense systems. Many naval forces like the United States, Japan or South Korea, for example, integrate naval-mounted air defense systems as part of their national air defense strategies. The challenge I'd suggest from a North Korean perspective is the air defense challenges just in their immediate region are so frankly oppressive that it's hard to imagine any realistic number of these vessels surviving any kind of concerted attack. The South Korean Navy and Air Force have extensive anti-shipping capability. South Korea has also showed off anti-ship ballistic missiles for its MRLs. And if you assume that the North Korean ships are relatively short-ranged and intended for operations primarily fairly close to home, it's hard to see how they'd realistically avoid the South Koreans not detecting a giant North Korean warship and then saturating it with enough incoming to reliably sink it. If you factor the United States into the equation as well, the threat picture becomes even more oppressive. Now you have to deal with things like the stealthy long-range anti-ship missile. And the question becomes, can the North Korean sensor suite reliably detect a very low observability missile that might be sea skimming before it slams into the side of the ship? It's obviously important not to over-extrapolate from any individual campaign, but we need to remember this asymmetric matchup between United States air power and defending Navy is not a hypothetical. In the recent war and the on and off again action since, there's a case that larger Iranian surface combatants might have been amongst the least survivable assets in Iranian inventory. They couldn't hide or be dug in deep like TELs, they couldn't be shuffled around the country like jets. They were often detected, and in relatively short order, even when at dock and so nominally protected by ground-based air defence systems, they were picked apart by air power like it was Taranto all over again. Sure, these North Korean ships might have better surface-to-air missile suites and more CWIS than the Iranian equivalents, but you're also talking about operating a region where there's a lot more anti-shipping firepower present. You wouldn't have just 2 aircraft carriers doing a bulk of the heavy lifting. There are American air bases in South Korea and Japan. You have to factor in the ROK's air force, and so it's hard to imagine the North Koreans not facing an exact level of incoming threat, pretty much custom selected to reliably overwhelm their defences. In a conventional war scenario, North Korea just isn't going to be able to slug it out at sea, and so it seems odd to invest in platforms optimised for that kind of high-end fight. Expressed another way, if Russia struggles to make its surface ships survivable against the Ukrainians in the Black Sea, how do you think the North Koreans would go trying to make their ships survivable against the likes of the US or ROK? And if the goal instead of building these more blue water Navy-style ships is to go and do blue water Navy-style power projection, there are again questions I have to ask when it comes to the investment logic. There are presumably reasons North Korea might want the ability to send ships further afield. Deterring countries from boarding ships that might be engaged in alleged sanction busting might be one example, as we've seen with the Russians sometimes do by sending Russian Navy warships alongside Shadow Fleet tankers. However, depending on the scenario and settings you assume, these North Korean destroyers might not be the most cost-effective tools for the job. What do I mean? Well, firstly, let's say you're imagining projecting power in an actual shooting war scenario. You actually expect it to potentially come to blows, so the combat power of the ship in question does matter, meriting potentially a larger ship, and your goal is to be able to physically defend an escorted vessel or your national interests far abroad. Problem, against any reasonably likely opponent, you're just going to die. Exhibit A, relatively modern Iranian surface combatant returning from India to Iran, converted into the latest piece of evidence that at sea there are 2 types of ships, submarines and targets. It seems deeply unrealistic that one or flotilla of these destroyers, or the later 10,000 tonners operating far away from North Korea's ability to support them, would be able to handle something like a submarine or concerted air attack. These ships don't appear to have been optimised for anti-submarine warfare duties, and even if they were, fast attack subs with modern torpedoes are just so dangerous that if one happens to be in the area, there's a reasonable chance you're going to be meeting the Moskva in short order. Even if US fast attack submarines might locally be in short supply, both the ROK and Japan have conventional submarine forces in the roughly 20+ range. And if intelligence suggests these North Korean ships might be nuclear armed, I imagine there's decent odds that they or some other asset gets assigned to the problem. And if instead the goal of the ship is to project power in situations short of war, so just provide a deterrent by being there, forcing an opponent to make the choice between not boarding a tanker and shooting at you, for example, then as the Russians have demonstrated, you don't really need a full-size destroyer, you just need something. The Russians have gotten away by escorting Shadow Fleet tankers with corvettes, for example, and if a corvette didn't have the range necessary because you were concerned they'd just start intercepting your ships further afield, for example, then in that case, what you'd need arguably isn't a relatively short-range warship armed to the absolute teeth. It's a ship with a heck of a lot of range, good sea-keeping qualities, and a credible armament. The irony isn't entirely lost on me that around the same time North Korea was commissioning its 5,000-ton destroyer with a massive missile armament, the Germans were in the process of cancelling their much longer-ranged, much heavier frigate with a much smaller missile armament. The reason I say this is ironic is that arguably, if you were Germany, concerned about engaging Russian warships relatively close to home, there's a case to be made you might benefit from something a little bit closer to the North Korean design. Relatively affordable, with a bit of endurance on it, and as many missiles as you can fit. While a North Korean flag waver or escort ship might benefit from being closer to the cancelled German design. Larger, less heavily armed, but designed for sustained, far abroad operation. So the core point I come back to is basically this. What is the North Korean Navy actually meant to do? There's no requirement that military strategies and objectives be strictly rational, and different countries are going to approach the problem in different ways. But as a thought exercise, if you were drafting objectives for the KPA, you might come up with some very broad goals. Regime security and internal stability, conventional deterrence and coercive capacity targeting the Republic of Korea, nuclear deterrence with much more global reach extending as far out as the United States, and then also softer objectives like prestige. It's arguably clear how the KPAN could fit into some of those objectives. Submarines might be well suited to deterrence duty, for example, even if they're not particularly well optimised for internal security purposes, but it's hard to see where a large fleet of large surface combatants would be the most cost-efficient tool possible. If the goal is to provide survivable nuclear deterrence, then submarines are probably a better bet than surface ships that would be sunk rapidly in the event of a conflict. If the goal is to project power and escort ships during peacetime, then this ship has too shorter legs and too many missiles. And if the goal is to win high-intensity naval engagements against the United States Navy or the South Koreans, then it shouldn't be. Because if nothing else, those two much larger, wealthier forces are going to be constantly right-sizing and configuring their navies to deal with a potential Chinese naval threat, and there is no realistic universe in which US Pyongyang managed to create a KPAN even somewhat equivalent to the People's Liberation Army Navy. Thankfully, very thankfully, I don't work for North Korean military procurement. But if I did, a conventional blue water navy with a bunch of high-end surface combatants intended to slug it out in a conventional peer conflict wouldn't exactly be near the top of my investment recommendations list. If you assume the North Korean goals as something like internal stability, foreign deterrence, and then a dash of international prestige and power projection, the kind of force design you come up with is a bit of an interesting thought exercise, with the real emphasis being on how you can spend as little money as possible to be as scary and effective as possible. Because we joke about North Korea being limited in terms of its resources, but it's important to stress how limited. For me, some of these standout yes but headlines of 2026 have been those like the one on the right there, describing a kind of recent North Korean economic success story. That article talks about such freely available bellwether indicators as taxis being available in Pyongyang, but admittedly, assessing the North Korean economy suffers from many of the same drawbacks as trying to assess the old Soviet economy. Market pricing mechanisms just don't tend to play nice with state command economies that are notoriously opaque with their data. But based on some of the figures we do have, like estimates prepared by the Bank of Korea in the South, there is some truth to the story. They assess that the North Korean economy grew by about 3.1% in 2023, 3.7% in 2024, and we can infer probably continue to grow somewhat in 2025. That, however, misses at least two pieces of critical context. Firstly, those recent gains of 2024 and 2023 have to be measured against contractions in 2022, 21, 20, 18, 17 and 15. What I've got here is a chart showing the assessed change by year in percentage terms, meaning that in real terms, so adjusting for inflation, the North Korean economy has had a couple of recent growth years, but only following on from a couple of quite bad ones. The second asterisk is basically growth relative to what? Because in absolute terms, this is still a country where GDP is measured in tens of billions of US dollars in total, and the country is arguably well short of where it should be compared to its available natural and human resources. Essentially, I'm suggesting that as well as measuring the overall size of an economy, it's worth giving some thought to how large and powerful it is relative to the resources it has available. If you were an alien who didn't really understand the Earth, for example, and you looked at the likes of the United States, Russia, or Australia, you'd probably guess that, yeah, the vaguely continent-sized landmass with a shit ton of natural resources is probably going to turn out to be a relatively wealthy country. By that measure, it seems kind of strange to describe North Korea's situation as an economic miracle when they've managed to widen the wealth gap with the less resource-rich South to a truly startling degree. From a military industry perspective, of course, North Korea does have its own unique advantages. In particular, it's better able to mobilise its resources than many other countries are. Forget trying to attract a new generation of American Gen Z talent into the military shipbuilding sector, when they could otherwise be working in so many other places. In North Korea, Kim Jong-un can just declare that he wants some boats and that you're going to build them, and everyone involved implicitly knows that saying, nah, I'd like to go study instead or work in the North Korean equivalent of Starbucks is probably a lifespan limiting manoeuvre. And so to that end, especially with financial and technical assistance from abroad and the industrial capital they do have, I don't think we should doubt the ability of North Korea to build this kind of navy if they decide that's what they're going to make their priority. But they've also very clearly indicated this isn't their only priority. Kim Jong-un has also said he wants North Korea to have the world's strongest nuclear forces. The country is trying to modernise its ground combat technology, expand its ballistic missile force, churn out the nuclear warheads, modernise the submarine force. There is going to be calls for funding to purchase additional aircraft from Russia or otherwise modernise the air force. And in amongst all that, you might want to be able to spare at least a couple of won for the civilian economy as well. Partly by fate and partly by choice, North Korea operates in a very challenging military threat environment. The three countries it most commonly describes as potential adversaries, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and United States, all have technologically advanced militaries with long-range strike capabilities, multifaceted ISR including a significant space presence, and the potential to network sensors and shooters in a way that's going to be very dangerous for a surface warship. In the war in the Middle East, the Iranian Navy didn't have to deal with anything like what the North Koreans would face in terms of ground and naval-based South Korean firepower. What they faced was American air power operating a long way away from bases it was actually allowed to use, and in arguably one of the war's more predictable outcomes, they got absolutely smashed. During that war, there's a lot about the American strike effort you could argue didn't entirely deliver, but the campaign against Iran's larger ships wasn't one of them. Historically, much better resource countries than North Korea have looked at this threat picture and decided to take a different approach. The Soviets did have a surface fleet for various missions, but they ploughed their resources into asymmetric assets. Submarines, submarines, and submarines, long-range anti-ship missile threats, the kind of which China is investing in. And when they did design surface combatants to potentially take on NATO forces, well, we've talked a little bit about their design philosophy. With their approach, the North Koreans appear to be throwing a lot of that idea away. And so if I was going to stick some bottom-line conclusions on all this, they'd probably go something like this. Right in the headline of this episode, I've used the word weird, but perhaps in the end, not for the reasons some people might have expected. I'd argue the weird thing here isn't that North Korea can build ships like this. They do have shipyards, an industrial workforce, and especially with access to dual-use civilian components and Russian technical assistance, I think it would be weirder if they couldn't figure out how to build a large, relatively seaworthy hull, stick a bunch of VLS on it, and load it with missiles. The weird thing is that they're actually choosing to do so. Yes, even against a much more powerful opponent, ships that can potentially carry nuclear-tipped cruise missiles are always going to be a military threat. But in that case, the threat's not the ship so much as it is the nuclear missiles. And arguably, unless you have a reason for moving those nuclear or conventional missiles and offensive systems far afield, what the North Koreans are arguably achieving by putting them all on a ship rather than, say, concealable ground-based launchers that could have decoys and fortifications associated or other more survivable platforms, is taking those valuable munitions and capabilities that they're always going to have a limited supply of and concentrating them on exactly the kind of platform their potential opponents are going to find easiest to identify, track, and destroy. As the war in Iran arguably showed, it can be much harder to hunt launchers that are hidden in caves or mountains than it is to ID and smash warships at harbour. And if North Korea actually does do what they claim and go up to a 10,000-tonne design in the future, the problem arguably gets worse, not better. Because all else being equal, you now have even fewer platforms that are even easier to identify and track, but still with no realistic possibility of you packing enough defensive systems into the thing that it can realistically survive a concerted attempt by any of your realistic potential opponents to go ahead and sink it. Now, you can argue, and I think it's a fair argument, that in a country like this, it wouldn't be unusual to build one or two more impressive prestige pieces to fly the flag and appear in the media and serve as a demonstration of what your industry is supposedly capable of. But the DPRK isn't talking about building one or two destroyers, they're talking about cranking out a fleet of them. And for a country in their strategic position, a conventional blue water fleet is just an absolutely baffling investment decision. None of this is to say, especially if these ships perform as they're meant to on paper, that these won't be notable, relatively dangerous military assets. They will, especially if they have nukes on them. But on the long, long list of things that North Korea could have purchased instead that were even more dangerous or more cost-effective and could potentially deploy a nuclear warhead, some might suggest that a large fleet of blue water DDGs and quasi-cruisers was a long way from being a podium option. Other nations in the region may well react and adjust their planning. But given the aforementioned surge in investment meant to factor in a growing People's Liberation Army Navy, it'll probably be a fairly tall order for Pyongyang to build, maintain, and cruise ships fast enough to keep their surface warfare capabilities growing faster than all the anti-ship capabilities in the region. Essentially, the ships might be externally impressive, have some prestige value, and not be entirely militarily useless. But I imagine a number of regional military planners might be very happy for every one that becomes a destroyer, rather than a nuclear-armed TEL, a ballistic missile submarine, or just about anything else. To me, at least, from an investment logic perspective, the whole thing has vaguely Plan Z vibes about it. Extremely ambitious and capable of turning out a couple of ships that might play well for the cameras, but militarily a doomed effort, and a massive misallocation of resources. But hey, at least the interior is pretty plush. And alright, let's do a channel update to close out. Firstly, thank you to all of you who participated in the exercise in managed democracy the other day that picked the topic for the week. Usually that isn't going to be possible, but occasionally I do have multiple episodes on the go that can potentially be used, and where that happens, I'll try and throw the question to YouTube or Patreon where I can. As a topic, North Korea is always an interesting one to delve into, because it's once so strange that I think it has to merit the occasional joke or 10, but at the same time you have to remember that behind all that, you do have the ongoing story of an incredibly oppressive regime and a lot of human suffering. Every country has to make trade-offs when it chooses to invest in defence production and readiness as opposed to some other civilian purpose. But especially when it comes to North Korea, it's worth remembering that every won spent on firing cruise missiles into the ocean is one that very painfully has to be taken from somewhere else. On the Patreon and email side, I have started to chew my way through the backlog, but if you've sent a message and are still waiting for a reply, be aware it might still take a while as there's a lot to get through. Finally, on the Peru Gaming side, I'll be trying to close out Solar Nations 2 and Zephon in the next week or so, at which point it should be almost time for the return of Terra Invicta with a new DLC scenario, and a little bit further down the track, I'm hoping for the return of X4 as well. I think that's all for the moment. Thank you very much all of you for your ongoing engagement and support, and with any luck, I hope to see you all again next week.